Thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate all of you, the attendance of all of you. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to this important roundtable on current conditions for human rights defenders and lawyers in China and its implications for U.S. policy. Commissioner Merkley will be here shortly, I believe. I'm not sure that Nisha Desai Biswal is here yet. She's Assistant Administrator for Asia at USAID. I believe she will join us too. I've been a member of the Congressional Executive Commission on China since its inception in 2001 after the House and Senate passed PNTR with China. The Commission's done excellent work in raising awareness about human rights and the rule of law in the People's Republic of China. I was honored to be appointed co-chair of this commission in early May. The Commission monitors developments in China closely and creates records of cases of political imprisonment in China. This year alone, the Commission has created over 400 records for the Commission's political prisoners database. In addition, in 2011, the Commission has already published 39 reports on human rights, and the rule of law in China is now preparing its annual report due out in October. As co-chair, I'm privileged to host this roundtable on such an important and timely issue. There are a number of Commission vacancies. I hope that they will be filled soon. In the meantime, I want to ensure that anyone is interested in the Commission's work, that it will continue, and that the outstanding staff has continued this important mission. When all the Commissioner slots are filled, we'll begin the robust agenda of hearings and roundtables. Before we get started, I'd like to thank Doug Grove behind me. Doug, on this side, Doug. The staff director who will be leaving the Commission for his tremendous service to our country. I look forward to working with him in his new role. Thank you for all that you've done with this Commission. I'd also like to thank Lawrence Liu, who, when I have to leave in about 30 or 40 minutes, will chair this roundtable. Many of you know him very well, having served in as acting staff director for the foreseeable future. I wanted to introduce Wei Jingsheng, who walked the halls of Congress with me and others in 1999 and 2000 in opposition to the congressional vote that took place, and I appreciate his courage from 2 decades of courage that he showed in China and his activism since in Canada and in our country, and I'm so appreciative that he has joined us. Our work continues. This roundtable is not only timely but critical to the U.S.-China relationship. In February of this year, the Chinese government launched one of the harshest political crackdowns in years. Just in the last 4 months, hundreds of citizens have been interrogated, placed under illegal house arrest, sent to labor camps, or detained. More disturbing has been the so-called disappearance of more than 20 Chinese citizens. Officials have simply taken them away without saying why or where they're being held. Detained outside of the legal process, they obviously face the risk of torture. Those targeted include many of China's most prominent rights advocates, lawyers, whistleblowers. They include the well-known artist Ai Weiwei, advocating on behalf of school children killed in a devastating earthquake. Chinese police detained Ai in April. He was just released on bail this week. We know that's not really real release, and we still are concerned about him and still not happy with what has happened to him, even with being released on bail. The government's also detained people like the human rights lawyer Teng Biwao. Teng is a well-known law professor at one of China's top universities. When not teaching, he's a tireless advocate for some of China's most vulnerable. He's helped defend poor, indigent criminal suspects and has advocated for enslaved child workers. In February, Teng disappeared for months and only resurfaced recently. In any modern society, brave and noble citizens such as Ai and Teng would be celebrated. Why does the Chinese government, we ask, consider them enemies? What does this crackdown mean for human rights lawyers, mean for activists who follow in their footsteps? What roles the internet and social media played in the crackdown? What is the Chinese government's disregard of its own laws in these cases? A disregard well documented by this commission. What does it mean for legal reform and the rule of law in China? How should the U.S. respond? If we begin, I'd like to introduce the other participants on the roundtable and ask each of them for their comments. Then we'll begin to do questions and discussion. Okay. Let me start with USAID. Nisha Biswal is here. If she would be willing to start, Nisha, with your comments. Are you ready, or you want to wait a minute? Okay, fair enough. Thanks, welcome, good to see you again. To my right is Elizabeth Wickeri, who is Executive Director and Adjunct Professor of Law at the Leitner Center for International Law at Fordham Law School. Professor Wickeri is also a member of the Committee to Support Chinese Lawyers and has published numerous articles on human rights and civil societies. Elizabeth, why don't you begin? Then I'll go around the table this way and end with you, Nisha. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am really grateful for the opportunity to participate in today's roundtable and for your leadership on this important topic. I'd like to thank you, the fellow commissioners, and also the CECC staff for inviting me here. I'm here today representing the Leitner Center for International Law and Justice at Fordham, and specifically the Committee to Support Chinese Lawyers, which is an independent NGO based at the center. The committee is a group of lawyers from outside of China whose mission is to support lawyers in China in their quest to support the rule of law there. We do this through public education, research, advocacy, and outreach. Today's roundtable is extremely timely and important because the conditions for rights defenders and human rights lawyers in China are in flux. Since February 2011, following online calls for a Jasmine revolution, rights defenders and lawyers have been increasingly detained, disappeared, abused, and subject to a range of strict methods of surveillance and control, and this even after their release. In my comments today, I'd like to in particular highlight the especially pronounced chilling effect that this suppression has caused. I will suggest that individuals that have been most seriously impacted are still in need of public support, public calls for support and attention to their cases by governments as well as other actors. Concerns for human rights defenders and lawyers in China is not something we come to anew today. Indeed, on many occasions over the past several years, we have had cause to voice our concerns about the difficult position for these actors in China. For example, in the run-up to the Beijing Olympic Games, during important visits to Beijing by dignitaries, on sensitive historical dates such as June 4th, and of course in the wake of the announcement that Liu Xiaobo would receive the Nobel Peace Prize. Activists during those times would be confined to their homes, brought in for questioning, and barred from leaving the country. But these conditions were generally loosened following the completion of the sensitive moment. Seasoned rights defenders and human rights lawyers used to these modes of harassment would generally return to their work upon release. However, in the 4 months since February of this year, the situation has deteriorated significantly, in particular for the human rights lawyers who have, among other things, taken on the most unpopular criminal defense cases. The deterioration represents a marked shift in at least two ways, I think. First, the breadth of the crackdown that led to the detention and disappearance of so many individuals. As you mentioned, at least 20 disappearances and detentions, and many, many more harassments and people put under surveillance. Second, in the wake of the eventual releases of these individuals, there's an eerie silence among lawyers and other defenders who would previously have remained vocal and outspoken in carrying out their work. That was admittedly unpopular already with the authorities. Even casual meetings for lunch or coffee have become difficult to arrange because of the fear of associating with others working in the field. This is especially true, of course, with meetings with foreigners. The result of these two differences has been a substantial chilling effect and a decrease in the space and people available and willing to carry out human rights and legal advocacy in China. The fact that lawyers and rights defenders have come out of detention less willing to return to work tells us a little something about their experiences before, during, and after detention. Many were simply disappeared as opposed to being formally detained. Reports emerged about serious mistreatment, abuse, and torture while they were held. On release, people have had to sign statements admitting guilt or promising to behave. In the aftermath of their detention, they and family members have lived under very strict conditions, ranging from constant surveillance to family members being arrested with their partners to young children not being permitted to leave home to attend school. And as troubling as these stories are, it is the silence among formerly outspoken and energetic lawyers that is especially troubling to me, and suggests that in the immediate aftermath of this crackdown, legal advocacy and human rights work in China is stalled. It has become more difficult, in particular, to find lawyers who are willing to take on sensitive cases, including where lawyers themselves are accused of a crime. Shanghai-based lawyer Li Tiantian, who was disappeared on February 19 and reemerged on May 24th, is one of the few individuals who has spoken out about her experience. She noted on Twitter that, quote, "The kind of fear that you can describe as small, while the kind of fear that you can't speak of is the greatest." Lawyers are important not simply because they are lawyers per se, but rather because they have a multiplier effect with respect to human rights promotion and protection. They play a fundamental role within the system, protecting the rights of other civic actors, vulnerable citizens, and activists. Their special role, however, also makes them the target of attacks by the authorities. Well before February this year, human rights lawyers in China faced serious challenges to fulfilling their professional responsibilities through legal and procedural obstacles, intimidation and abuse, and extralegal attacks. This treatment of lawyers gives us a vital window into what's happening in China today. The significance of the fear that Li Tiantian speaks of cannot be understated. The role of human rights lawyers does not rest solely on whether or not their cases are successful. Indeed, these successes may be few and far between. The importance, rather, is based on the possibility of their successes when they are able to try. So what policy implications emerge from this? I have 4 preliminary thoughts. First, that more voices, including those from the U.S. government, are needed to call attention to the many individuals that have been targeted in this recent wave of attacks. Through this attention, they may be supported and provided some more space to work. This includes public calls as well as sustained private dialogue with Chinese actors, official and unofficial. Second, that international standards promoting the rights and freedoms of human rights defenders and lawyers should be promoted and used to demonstrate how lawyers' rights and others' rights are being curtailed. Specifically, the UN Basic Principles on the Role of Lawyers, which members of the UN General Assembly, including China, adopted without dissent, are useful and can also support domestic Chinese standards in existence. Third, expanding opportunities for the training and exchanges of Chinese lawyers with colleagues abroad remains an important avenue and provides space for much-needed dialogue, but these must also include Chinese lawyers doing rights defense and other public interest work. And fourth, as Professor Jerry Cohen, a member and senior advisor to our Committee to Support Chinese Lawyers, has increasingly emphasized, there is a need for foreign lawyers, many of whom benefit from doing business in China, to stand up and speak out for their Chinese colleagues. Finally, I'll end on what I hope are 2 somewhat positive notes. First, there are some well-connected lawyers and legal scholars who have begun to express concern for their marginalized colleagues. And these can only benefit from being supported by other expressions of support inside and outside of China. And second, I was also happy to see, somewhat hesitantly, that Ai Weiwei was released yesterday. An advocate for change, it's troubling that he was detained for so long with so little information about his condition. But it is a case that maybe demonstrates how sustained media attention and public calls can have positive results. Again, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity, and I'm happy to answer any questions you and others may have.
Thank you, Ms. McCurry. Xiaorong Li is an independent scholar, has published numerous articles on topics including human rights and democracy. Since 1989, she served as an executive director in the boards of human rights organizations which she has co-founded. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you all. The serious backsliding of the Chinese government's human rights records had started before the 2008 Summer Olympics, highlighted with the jailing of activists Hu Jia, Huang Qi, and many others, torture and disappearance of lawyer Gao Zisheng, imprisonment of Nobel Peace Prize laureate Liu Xiaobo, and the house arrest of his wife, both incommunicado, and the house arrest of Chen Guangcheng after his release. Yesterday's release of the artist Ai Weiwei on bail, waiting for trial, was in the same fashion as his arrest, with total disregard of the Chinese law. All this took place in the larger context of increasingly severe restrictions on freedom of expression and association, repression against the religious and ethnic minorities, and significant rollback on the rule of law reform. Since February, according to the information documented by the group Chinese Human Rights Defenders, the Chinese government has criminally detained a total of 49 individuals outside the Tibet and Xinjiang regions. As of today, 9 of them have been formally arrested, 3 sent to re-education through labor camps, 32 have been released, but most of them not free, out of which 22 have been released on bail to wait for trial, while 4 remain in criminal detention. In addition, 1 individual is being held in a psychiatric hospital, and 1 lawyer remains under residential surveillance in unknown location. At least 24 individuals are confirmed as having been subjected to enforced disappearance, some for as long as 70 days. At least 10 of them remain unaccounted for as of today. Given the difficulties in collecting and verifying information, these numbers are far from being complete. There are unconfirmed reports that extremely nervous authorities at the top approved a list of thousands of individuals as the targets of this crackdown. I particularly want to draw your attention to the fact that the Chinese government extensively and ostentatiously used extrajudicial tactics such as enforced disappearance, secret detention, and torture in the current crackdown, in clear violation of the International Convention Against Torture, which the Chinese government signed and ratified in 1988. The abuses included beating, use of electric baton on genitals, sleep and food deprivation, repeated and lengthy interrogations, on occasion for up to 20 hours at a time, forcible injections and the ingestion of unknown substances, and forced stress positions such as sitting motionless on small stools for many hours at a time, and the threats to their families, and so on and so forth. These are documented, but we can't make public and who provided the information, who specifically undergone those torture treatments. What impact does this have on U.S. policy towards China? The Chinese government has fought back to criticisms, has threatened with economic sanctions of its own. That should be expected, but that is not the reason for the U.S. government to give up on public pressure and replace it with closed-door dialogues and strategic partnership with China. We see very little as to what, if any, concrete outcome is achieved through the U.S.-China human rights dialogues. Though the Obama administration has been unusually outspoken about China's rights abuses since its second year in office, the dialogues seem to do more to appease critics of complacency than to secure any real change. It's a diversion from the fact that nothing of consequence is being accomplished, because the Chinese government knows there is nothing to fear from delivering no concrete results. The government even welcomes closed-door dialogues because they remove the spotlight from exposing China's human rights abuses. The Chinese government loves to cite the existence or resumption of dialogues as signs of progress on human rights. When the Chinese government clearly lacks any political willingness to curtail its violations, any quiet diplomacy and behind-the-door engagement must be coupled with public pressure. Dialogue and cooperation can be useful, but only when the partner government shows political willingness to improve. The U.S.-China human rights dialogues must be tied to concrete and publicly articulated benchmarks if it's going to continue. These benchmarks should not be ignored when they prove inconvenient, gets in the way of U.S. economic and strategic interests. Substantive international pressure can make a big difference, as we see in the release of Ai Weiwei. By exposing or condemning abuses, conditioning access to military aid, imposing targeted sanctions on abusive individual officials, and calling for prosecution of those responsible, the U.S. government can increase the cost to the Chinese government for harassing activists and lawyers. International pressure can help create space for local activists to push the government to reform. And we have been told over and over again by those released from prison that when they know there's such help from outside and pressure, and they do feel better, and they feel encouraged to fight on and know that they are not there alone. Thank you.
Sweet. Sarah Cook is the Asia Research Analyst and Assistant Editor, Freedom on the Net at Freedom House. She's extensively researched human rights situation in China and co-edited the English translation of a memoir by Gao Jiesheng, the prominent rights attorney who remains missing. Welcome, Ms. Liz. Thank you. Thanks, Ms. Cook.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you very much to the CECC for inviting me here today. One of the topics I've been asked to speak about today is the Internet dimension of the work of Chinese human rights lawyers and the repression that they faced, as well as to reflect on some of the underlying dynamics that have contributed to the latest crackdown. I thought I would focus in my remarks on 3 points. One, how human rights lawyers and activists have used the Internet and social media in China. Two, the Internet controls these individuals have faced, and how these are actually a microcosm of a broader and very robust system of Internet control. And three, how the long-term practice of the Chinese Communist Party using arbitrary extralegal measures to suppress freedom of expression has actually laid the foundation for this more recent crackdown. As in many countries, when you go down the list of China's leading human rights lawyers and activists, almost every single one of them has used the Internet in very creative ways to expose human rights abuses, educate fellow citizens about their legal rights, and advocate for rule of law reforms. As a few examples, Gao Jiesheng published open letters documenting the torture and killing of Falun Gong practitioners. Xu Zhiyong blogged about the inhumane treatment meted out to petitioners, particularly in black jails. Tang Biao used Twitter to be able to alert fellow netizens when he was being arbitrarily detained. And Ai Weiwei produced a video of people reading the names of children who had died in the Sichuan earthquake and then circulated online. But what's different from the dynamics in democratic settings and what makes these efforts even more impressive is the fact that these people are engaging in such activities in the context of the most robust, sophisticated, and multifaceted internet and censorship apparatus in the world. An apparatus that, according to a study that Freedom House released in April, has tightened and actually been enhanced over the past 2 years. When you look at these particular individuals and even the examples I just noted, they have encountered the gamut of internet controls that play out in China today, from blocked websites to disabled blogging accounts, from, quote, invitations to tea, to more lengthy enforced disappearances and torture. Many of them keep multiple blogs because they have to play a hide-and-seek game with censors, hoping that even if commentary on one blog happens to be deleted, perhaps another blog hosting company will be a bit more lenient. So, for instance, for Gao Jiesheng to be able to post an open letter, or for Tang Biao to use Twitter, the first thing they have to do is safely get to the other side of the so-called Great Firewall. Ai Weiwei and Xu Zhiyong both had their blogs shut down in 2009 and 2010. And in late 2010, dozens of lawyers and activists had their personal internet and mobile phone communication ability completely shut off in an apparent effort to stop them from spreading the news about Liu Xiaobo's Nobel Peace Prize. And then there are the offline tactics, as we've heard. And though the latest detentions have been the longest, over the past 5 years, most of the individuals that we've been speaking about have at one point or another encountered some form of abduction, beating, or torture, including being shocked with electric batons. And one particularly insidious dynamic that I thought would be worth noting is that as these real world measures against them have escalated, in some instances we've seen a corresponding implementation of censorship related to these individuals' names, and essentially an attempt to make them disappear in the virtual world as well as in the real world. So following Ai Weiwei's abduction in April, censorship was not only applied to his name, but there were censorship directives that had been leaked that indicate there were orders to delete within 10 minutes an editorial that made a veiled reference to Ai Weiwei's work and advocacy on the Sichuan earthquake. Gao Jiesheng, who has been disappeared for over a year, was listed as, his name specifically was listed as a sensitive keyword on a list of such words leaked by an employee of Baidu, the largest search engine in China, in 2009. And a quick test that we at Freedom House had conducted shows that a search of Gao Zhisheng's name on Baidu actually pretty much almost all produces state-run news sources referring to him as a quote, criminal, and there are no links to his own writings. What's striking in the case of both of these men is that in an earlier era, they were actually the subject of quite a bit of official support and media attention. So Gao Zhisheng in 2001 was named one of the top 10 lawyers in China in a legal debate competition that was a television competition hosted by the Ministry of Justice. Ai Weiwei, as many of us and many of you may know, was invited to design the bird's nest for the 2008 Beijing Olympics. But a few years later, as their advocacy increased and as they started touching on some of the issues that the Chinese government and the human rights abuses the Chinese government once most hidden, the state is now hoping that people will forget that they exist as well. So why is this happening? As other panelists have noted, we at Freedom House have also observed in our various assessments of political rights and civil liberties a backsliding in the Chinese government's commitment to the rule of law since 2006 and even more so since 2008. But what's worth noting is that even during the earlier part of the decade, when limited legal reforms appeared to be moving forward, in parallel, there still existed a very extensive extra-legal world, a world of makeshift detention centers, forced labor camps, and plainclothes police forces torturing with impunity. And in fact, that is the world that tens of thousands of petitioners and Falun Gong practitioners have been experiencing for years. So many of the lawyers that we're talking about today, they actually encountered that world, and they talk about it in their writings, voicing concern that the tactics and strategies developed to suppress one group can be quickly and easily applied to others, putting every Chinese citizen at risk. So in one way, looking at the current series of abductions, they cannot be viewed in a vacuum. Rather, what we're seeing manifest in recent months is an expansion of suppression. It is a reflection of a decision taken somewhere at the top of the party that a group of individuals whose work and activism had previously been tolerated are now persona non grata, and that the party is willing to apply the full force of a pre-existing extra-legal repressive apparatus to silence them. And of course, such a decision is made possible by the fact that they are unconstrained by firm institutional mechanisms like an independent judiciary. From that perspective, I think if Gao Zhisheng and some of the other lawyers were here today, one thing that they would recommend is for U.S. policy to go beyond focusing only on them, despite the urgency of their plight. When you read their writings, you see that they urge serious action to address the full range of clients and causes they have defended. Taken together, the victims of Communist Party repression go far beyond dozens of activists, amounting to tens of millions of people. As Ms. Wakari noted, the lawyers themselves have encountered so many of these abuses and seen them and represent a microcosm of what's happening much more broadly in China. The lawyers would say that when the day comes that these people have their rights protected, that is when lawyers will no longer need to worry about being abducted or disbarred either. So one of the main recommendations we would recommend is to really give serious thought to what are some of the longer-term strategies the United States can do to more effectively address the broader range of human rights abuses in China, particularly of the most vulnerable and abused groups such as petitioners, Falun Gong practitioners, Uyghurs, Tibetans, and others who are often caught up in this extra-legal world. I have some other recommendations I've thought of, but I think my time is up, so I'll stop there, and I'd be happy to expand on any of the above during Q&A.
Thank you, Ms. Cook, and we'd like to have your recommendations for sure in writing, if not spoken also. Margaret Lewis, Associate President. We're joined by Senator Merkley from Oregon. Thank you, Jeff, for joining us. Margaret Lewis, Associate Professor of Law at Seton Hall. Her research focuses on the intersection of Chinese legal studies with criminal procedure, criminal law, and international law. She's a Public Intellectuals Program Fellow with the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. Thank you for joining us, Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and distinguished members of the committee for inviting me to join this roundtable and for all of the work of the Commission on helping Americans to understand China better, including these specific issues at hand. In my brief opening remarks, I've been asked to place the recent crackdown in the broader context of what this means for overall legal reform and rule of law developments in China, specifically with regard to criminal justice reforms. The path of legal reform in China never did run smoothly, but I think that it's fair to say that now is a particularly challenging time for legal reform in China. And in part, this reflects this overarching political climate that emphasizes stability and is wary of anyone who is seen as rocking the boat. A week from tomorrow, July 1st, marks the 90th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. And the party has demonstrated, I think, impressive adaptability over its 6 decades of uninterrupted rule. Now, despite reports about some disagreements among the high leaders of the Communist Party, what the public face has been is orderly transition on a periodic basis. This was seen in the early 2000s when we went from the 3rd generation leaders to the 4th generation leaders, and is currently playing out to the 5th generation leaders. Now, as the composition of the Politburo Standing Committee and that top leadership is taking shape, I think it's not surprising that candidates for the next generation of leadership are going to take a risk-averse stance when it comes to advocating for significant reforms, especially if those reforms might be unpopular with the current leaders. Looking beyond the immediate term, the current and rising members of the party leadership have openly applauded the harsh law and order tactics used by Bo Xilai, who is the Chongqing Party secretary and a rising star on the national scene. This praise for Bo's tactics raises serious questions whether even after the leadership transition takes place, will we see a more pro-reform climate. Now, exacerbating this cautious climate is the leadership's awareness about the popular unrest in the Middle East and the concern that fermenting discontent at home could blossom into China's own Jasmine Revolution. Now, it's difficult to qualify and figure out exactly how much public discontent is out there. We know that there's thousands and thousands of these mass incidents. But at a minimum, what we're seeing out of Beijing is a change in rhetoric, and not just talking about harmonious society, which is even on the front of trains now, but emphasizing social management and stability, and this social management of keeping a lid on things. From a legal reform perspective, my concern is that the government fundamentally views lawyers as undermining stability rather than improving it. And when I was in China last month, I personally was struck by the hesitancy, and Ms. Wickery mentioned this too, of people to speak candidly about legal reforms in a variety of meetings. And this is even, I think, markedly worse than when I was there last year. There has been a shift in attitude, and people are seeing a chilling effect about what kind of conversations we're able to have, even in unofficial settings. Now, turning particularly to how this climate impacts criminal justice reforms, there's no shortage of formal laws and regulations on the books. And in fact, this past year, we saw some ostensibly promising reforms. With respect to the criminal law, there was an amendment to the large criminal law this spring that reduced the number of death-eligible crimes by 13, limiting it now to 55 offenses as opposed to the prior 68. Now, in reality, this decrease is unlikely to have a real effect on the number of executions because the crimes they removed were seldom used anyways. So it looks much better than it probably will be in practice. As a further example of legal reforms in the criminal justice realm, this past year we also saw 2 new sets of rules dealing with evidentiary issues, and in particular, an ability to suppress illegally obtained evidence and most conspicuously coerce confessions. Now, the problem is the lawyers that are actually trying to seek to implement these rules are running into political roadblocks. At most, we've heard of maybe 1 or 2 examples of a lawyer actually being able to suppress illegal evidence, and even in that case, I guess the evidence got in through another route, so it had little practical impact. And in addition to the substantive challenges of the lawyers trying to be zealous advocates for their clients, what also is happening is the lawyers themselves are ending up being the criminal defendants. And we saw this in 2010, most notably with lawyer Li Zhuang, who was actually convicted for encouraging people to give false testimony. And considering such perils and also the general lack of social prestige for defense work, I think it's a wonder that people pursue careers as criminal defense lawyers in China at all, especially outside of the world of the relatively financially lucrative white-collar crime. But in speaking about the role of lawyers, it bears emphasizing that the topic of today's roundtable is the current conditions of both lawyers and rights defenders. As a member of the legal profession myself, I hope that all lawyers seek to defend people's rights. But in China, so-called rights defenders go beyond the licensed lawyers. There is a separate population of non-lawyers who are nonetheless seeking to use the legal system to effectuate change in China. And of course, exemplifying this is the blind activist Chen Guangcheng, who taught himself enough law that he could help out his fellow villagers with their grievances against the government. But since completing his 4-year sentence for disturbing traffic and damaging property, Chen and his family have been held under informal house arrest. And reports of government-sanctioned physical abuse underscore that the term soft detention utterly fails to capture the harsh reality that is Chen's post-prison life. Going forward, a key question is how can the PRC government manage expectations of the populace in the face of a graying population, growing environmental pressures, and other destabilizing effects? The incorrigible long-term optimist in me wants to believe that the government will eventually view lawyers as a positive force to help express citizens' grievances and effectively channel those grievances through a formal process instead of leaving people to go to the streets with their frustrations. However, at present, the emphasis is on the rhetoric of the rule of law with a reluctance to allow people to actually make use of the laws in a meaningful way. So finally, what are the implications for U.S. policy in light of this challenging landscape? The official U.S.-China human rights dialogue and the slightly less official legal experts dialogue are valuable, I think, for maintaining high-level bilateral discussions, though I think we must keep our expectations very modest when it comes to how these forums might actually spur legal reform in China. Though we cannot expect instant gratification from more informal legal cooperation, I remain convinced that sustained interpersonal contacts will serve a positive force for legal reform. For example, China's efforts to reduce wrongful convictions opens up possibilities for collaboration on projects regarding evidence techniques, including use of DNA evidence. And indeed, the new rules addressing the exclusion of illegally obtained evidence followed years of comparative legal work and many projects involving foreign assistance. The scope of substantial bilateral collaboration is no doubt limited at present, but there are shared avenues of interest that dovetail with the Chinese government's stated areas of reforms and that can and should be explored. So thank you for the opportunity to present a few thoughts, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lewis. I will open the question and turn it to Senator Merkley, who will chair the commission after I leave. Ms. Lee and Ms. Wakeri, your comments on kind of a several sort of array of things in terms of how important it is that American government and individual American elected officials and activists speak out. And what that means to prisoners, what that means to human rights activists is noted. Your comments that in some sense, though, the Chinese think they have nothing to fear because there's not much oomph behind our speaking out here in terms of what our government did. I heard your comments about President Obama and sort of what we do or don't do as a country. And how activists and people who have been imprisoned or on bail, how they're encouraged by international support. I hear all of that. I remember 10 years ago when Wei Jingsheng said to me as we were talking about PNTR, he made a statement which was a bit incendiary, but with great insight, I thought, if I could recall more or less exactly how he said it, although he said it in Mandarin, it was translated, obviously. He said the vanguard of the Communist Party in the United States is American CEOs, as they were lobbying the United States Congress for PNTR. Are American lawyers, not human rights lawyers, are American lawyers in China today working for U.S. corporations? Are they potentially allies of any of these human rights activists? Are they allies for other lawyers? Are there ways that that we can reach them in a way that they will stand up for human rights in China, or are they a lost cause because they don't want to jeopardize their position in the larger Chinese economy? And any of the four, you can answer that, but I'm looking at you too because you kind of led me to asking that.
Well, I certainly believe they can be a force for the good cause, and then I don't want to make any sweeping statement to lump them all into one category.
Well, let me interrupt if I could. Have you seen examples of it where that's happened? Any of you? I mean, the more important issue is how do we make that happen?
Well, the thing is how individual American businessmen, lawyers, and anybody goes to China doing something, what can they do? That's the larger question. I believe. We talking to a lot of activists, including Mr. Wei here, probably agree with me. We need to change the system in China. What we all individuals can do is to prepare for that change. we cannot, by any one of those professional groups in China from America, nobody can really change until the system is itself being changed. So in a way, lawyers, for example, going to China could be putting Band-Aids on a very sick system by saying, okay, improve your prison so you can more efficient to crack down on prisoners, or improve your police force so they can be more effective in crowd control. But those things can be helpful when the system changes. But if the system doesn't change all those things, years, more than 20 years, we've been pouring into humongous resources into rule of law reforms in China, training judges, policemen, prison guards, and legislators, as if those legislators have any independence. All those things seem a little laughable for the Chinese activists. But somehow, we need to look at the bigger picture. What happened in Egypt, in Tunisia? And was people were become somehow in the process. I recall there was a training workshop on nonviolence tactics last year in Egypt, in Cairo, and that became crucial. It's that sort of a work when the bigger movement comes, when the system started to crumble, those things can kick into place. In that sense, I support people going to China, doing business, lawyers going and doing training, whatever they do. But it's the fundamental piece that's missing here. We don't see a systematic U.S. government human rights policy towards China. How do we prepare for the kind of crumbling of the system, like what happened in Egypt?
Okay, Ms. we carry the wealth. Sorry to cut you off. The wealth that U.S. companies and U.S. consumers are helping to create in China. The argument against what Wei Jingsheng said a decade ago was that as there's more companies there and more wealth and more of a middle class, that freedom would follow. And there are many examples in history that didn't happen, but that was the argument they made. Is that happening? Is there a way of helping to make that happen? Is there a way of empowering or encouraging U.S. corporate lawyers, if for want of a better term, to step up and work on all the things that the four of you have devoted your professional lives to?
Yeah, certainly. I think that one of the things that the Committee to Support Chinese Lawyers was founded for was to try and tap the resources of that community, of the community of corporate lawyers and other business people potentially working inside China and benefiting from that work. It's not an easy task to make the issue of the role of human rights defenders and the crackdown on human rights lawyers relevant to corporate lawyers working for American law firms in Beijing. There have been a lot of informal conversations, but in terms of constituting formal meetings in Beijing, and even less so elsewhere in the country among American lawyers to raise their awareness on this issue, that's much more difficult. On the other hand, the Committee to Support Chinese Lawyers, as well as the New York City Bar Association, has instituted a number of meetings in New York to try and raise the awareness of corporate lawyers who have offices in Beijing about these issues. And so we've been doing that, particularly this year. The New York City Bar, the International Bar Association, and a number of other professional associations have written letters to highlight the cases of these individuals. Whether or not individual lawyers will take on this task, or perhaps law firms particularly, is another question. I think many of us may have seen Professor Cohen's opinion piece in the South China Morning Post a couple of weeks ago that looked especially at this issue, that despite the fact that a lot of different actors had spoken out on the recent crackdown, law firms were conspicuously silent about the fact that their Chinese colleagues were being especially abused.
Does Google's about face give you hope or make you cynical?
I I'm a hopeful person in general, so I think that I have to answer the question that way. It gives me hope, and certainly the New York City Bar, and more specifically the Committee to Support Chinese Lawyers, which is a separate entity, is trying to encourage law firms specifically, and law firms that have practices in China to take a stand on this issue. We're just in the early stages of reaching out to interested parties, so I can't yet predict whether or not the Google example will be one that they look to.
Then I'm going to turn it over to Senator Merkley to chair, but sorry to interrupt you, I'd like all four of you to think about what this commission can do to help empower and encourage American lawyers, whether they're law firms, whether they're corporate counsel, whatever, in China, here and in China, to step up on human rights, if that's not too tall an order. Your comments?
Well, I was a corporate lawyer in a former life, so perhaps I'm more sympathetic. But I was on the New York City Bar delegation that went to China, met with the Beijing Lawyers Association, Shanghai Lawyers Association, met with a bunch of foreign lawyers there. And I mean, the hard thing is that for the individual foreign lawyers, they have clients, and they do have a duty as a lawyer to do what's best for their clients. They're not there as human rights advocates. So they're very constrained in what they can do, because they know immediately, and they say this again and again, so they can't even do real pro bono work like they would do in the U.S. So they do things like give money to...
Well, all that yeah. if I could be so bold, is part of the corruption of this whole trade policy, this whole system, is you can't expect anybody representing their businesses to ever do the right thing for human rights, because they've got to take care of their businesses here. I understand all that. Of course, that's their fiduciary responsibility, but they're also human rights. They're also human beings. They're also American citizens with a set of values, I would hope, that might call on them to do something better.
I think we're going to need to get it out of the city bar or out of the bar associations, not out of the individual law firms, because no one's going to be the first mover. So I do think this movement to use the bar associations, maybe like American Chamber of Commerce has their group of lawyers, try to have it so it doesn't have the label of this individual law firm has taken this stand, but try to do it a little bit. I think that's going to be the movement, not getting a name list of necessary individual firms.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, just to build off of that, I mean, one result of the trip that Professor Lewis and I were both on to Beijing and Shanghai is that the New York City Bar Association has a memorandum of agreement with the Beijing Lawyers Association to cooperate on a number of issues, including human rights. And so this might be one way for American lawyers who are members of the New York City Bar in Beijing to coordinate efforts and work on these issues, as opposed to highlighting their firm's role.
I would just add, in terms of examples, and this is maybe more from the sphere of the internet world, but the power when the Chinese authorities hear voices of concern from populations that they're not used to hearing it from is pretty significant. In 2009, there was the example of this green dam software that the Chinese government had contracted a company to institute, and all of a sudden they came out with this regulation that every PC that was going to be imported to China had to have this particular software that was supposedly to protect children from pornography, but actual tests found that it was really targeted at censoring and very much filtering and monitoring information, including on issues like human rights groups, minorities, Falun Gong practitioners, and things like that. What happened was you had a real outcry from the Chamber of Commerce, I think there were from some maybe legal associations or business associations. It was a combination of that, as well as the voice from the netizens and some of the human rights lawyers, actually, that we've been talking about today. And it was really quite powerful, because I think it took the Chinese government off guard a bit, and they backed off. Now, they've still implemented this particular software in schools and things like that, but they really backed away from this big nationwide policy. So when you really have a multilateral front of concern, particularly when people are talking about the concerns from an economic and commercial perspective, the issues related to challenges of rule of law in China don't only affect Chinese citizens, they affect a lot of American companies, and that may be even one angle in terms of approaching them. Certainly in the case of the internet, of the Green Dam software, there was a strong sense that it was going to damage business for people who are trying to import technology into China.